Thank you so much for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Burke as our speaker for the University of Sussex Founding Historians Lecture for 2024. Professor Peter Burke, whose work is familiar to many, if not all of us, was educated at a grammar school in London, then won a scholarship to St John's College, Oxford, and another scholarship for postgraduate research at St Antony's College there. He was one of the first junior lecturers to be appointed at the University of Sussex, attracted by the interdisciplinary programme here, and he remained here for 17 years, from 1962 to 1979. He moved to Cambridge in 1979, where he became Professor of Cultural History, and he retired from the chair in 2004, but remains a Life Fellow of Emmanuel College. Professor Burke has been a visiting teacher or researcher in Berlin, Brussels, Canberra, Groningen, Heidelberg, Los Angeles, Nijmegen, Paris, Princeton, and Sao Paulo. I know he's inspired many of us, and my work as a cultural historian of early modern Europe is hugely indebted to his research, and I remember hearing talks from him when I was a graduate student at Cambridge. Peter Burke has published hundreds of articles and chapters and 30 books, from Culture and Society in Renaissance Italy, which is one of the set texts for our first year historians, some of whom are here, to A Social History of Knowledge, and most recently, put it here, Ignorance, A Global History. His work has been translated into 33 languages, and he holds 6 honorary PhDs, all from universities on the European mainland. And he's also a fellow of the British Academy. We're extremely grateful to welcome him back to Sussex, where he will talk to us about writing a history of ignorance, which I'm sure we can learn a lot about. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Laura, for the generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here lecturing at this university once again. It's been quite a time since my last lecture, I think, the one about polymaths. And it's an absolute age since my first lecture on this campus in November 1962, soon after I'd been appointed assistant lecturer, that's what they called the juniors in those days, in European history of the 16th and 17th centuries, just after I'd been interviewed in Stanmer House by the real 3 founding historians, that is, Asa Briggs, Martin White, who was Dean of European Studies, and Maurice Hudd, specialist on the French Revolution. But actually, that first lecture had absolutely nothing to do with the 16th and 17th centuries. My first lecture here was on the ideas of Sigmund Freud, and the reason I was giving that lecture was that there was a course with the rather grand title, The Modern European Mind, and that what we used to call a circus of lecturers, a different person giving a lecture in the course each week. Somebody had to speak on Freud, and my arm was very gently twisted, and I was already interested, and I said yes. The need to move outside one's comfort zone of specialization, or indeed the opportunity to move outside that comfort zone, that was really, that sums up the teaching at Sussex in the 60s. I can't speak for the students of that period, though doubtless some of them are here in this room now. But for me, the Sussex system was a form of continuing education, thanks especially to collaboration with colleagues who were not historians, philosophers like Michael Moran, sociologists like Serge Barbeau, teachers of English, French, and German literature, and teachers of the history of art like Hans Hess. Without this, if it hadn't been for the Sussex experience, I very much doubt whether 60 years later I would have dared to write a history of ignorance. The blank spaces on the map of knowledge, which Sussex described itself as redrawing in its manifestos of the early 60s. Now, why should I, or anybody else for that matter, want to write about the history of ignorance? Is such an enterprise really possible? Let me just sketch the context very quickly. Since the 1990s, one of the new forms of history which have been multiplying in the last decades is the history of knowledge, or better, the history of knowledges in the plural, the histories of different kinds of knowledge, not only academic disciplines, but practical knowledges ranging from gardening to diplomacy. Now, social historians of knowledge, among whom I count myself, are inspired by the sociology of knowledge that was developed just a century ago by Karl Mannheim. In his spirit, we tried to answer the question, who knew what in a given place at a given time? And as Mannheim liked to emphasize, in different situations. My own contributions to this field include one about exiles, that is, the distinctive contribution of exiled scholars to knowledge, thanks to their displacement and their struggle to build a new life, as one of them said, between two different cultures. And another book focused on polymaths, individuals who made original contributions to many disciplines, or in practice, several disciplines, and who were known in the 18th century as monsters of erudition. Once again, it was the distinctive contribution of the monsters that I was particularly trying to discover. For example, they would study subjects which were like in danger of disappearing in the gap between established disciplines. Alternatively, they would make original contributions to one discipline by using the methods or asking the questions which were normal in another one. I only realized afterwards how I got to want to ask those questions. In the late 60s, I made a friend of the Professor of Biology here, very interesting man called John Maynard Smith. Tremendous curiosity, including on what was happening in Eastern Europe at the time. So we would have lunch together and I would try to explain what Dubček was doing or what was happening in Poland and so on. Now, at one point, I don't know what we were talking about, but John said, if I'd made any contribution to biology, which he was one of the leading biologists in England at the time, it's because I didn't study it as an undergraduate. He'd gone to Cambridge, but he was to study engineering. Then he got the idea he would like to take a doctorate in biology. So much later, when I looked him up in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, I discovered he wrote his PhD on the evolution of the flight of birds. But he looked at that evolution with the eyes of an aeronautical engineer. So what he learned in the first discipline made him ask questions in the second one that the people who grew up in the second one hadn't thought of asking. So that was his breakthrough. So at a certain point in research, after decades of asking one big question, in my case about the history of knowledges, it often proves to be a good strategy to turn it upside down, hoping to get a fresh look at it. Hence, the move from people who were supposed to know everything to people who were dismissed as knowing nothing. And again, my plan was to write a social history. So, who was ignorant of what in a particular place or time? And at this point, I should confess that I always meant to entitle my book Ignorance, a Social History. But at the last minute, Yale University Press decided it would sell better if it had the word global in the title, and then without actually consulting me, they did it. One reviewer pointed out that the book wasn't global, and I wrote back that it had not intended to be. As so often happens, I began research with the idea that I was doing something that nobody had thought of before. And again, as so often happens, I quickly discovered that a small group of scholars, mainly sociologists, but not exclusively, had been studying ignorance for some years. Indeed, there were already enough scholars in that field to publish in 2016 a large and heavy volume entitled The Routledge International Handbook of Ignorance Studies. It's funny that the word handbook, which used to be used about a small book you could slip in your pocket, now fashionable to call really encyclopedic volumes that you can hardly lift handbooks. Anyway, this one had no fewer than 51 contributors. They included one historian of science, but no general or plain historian. And it seemed to me that we general or plain historians, just historians, no adjective, had something relevant to say. This contribution should be made, I believe, not by founding or occupying chairs in ignorance studies. Who would want to be called a professor of ignorance anyway? But the best way forward is to include ignorance in studies of decision-making in the past, since it played a crucial role in creating misunderstandings and facilitating disasters, and still does, of course. And so it's been, I think, unfairly neglected by professional historians. Now, one of the first things I learned when I started the research was that just like knowledge, ignorance is a term best used in the plural. There are so many varieties of ignorance, so many adjectives that have been applied to it, so many distinctions that need to be made. For example, conscious or unconscious ignorance. Socrates was hyper-conscious of his own ignorance. Most of us dimly aware that there is a lot out there that we don't know. When we think about ignorance, I think the chances are that the first examples that come to mind are what I would label simple ignorance. That is, just happening not to know something. Like, what's the name of the capital of Madagascar? You know? I don't, or at least I've forgotten. In contrast, other ignorance is focused, sometimes sharply focused. As in the case of scientists who realize that they don't know something important and they can describe what it is, and then that allows them to design a research project that will fill the hole. And for this reason, one leading physicist not many years ago, in the speech in which he accepted a Nobel Prize, described ignorance as the most important resource for scientists, and one that there was no danger of it running out even in the next few centuries. And a neurologist published a book in which he declared that ignorance drives science, I think for that reason. Another distinction, ignorance that is blameless and ignorance that the lawyers call culpable. Medieval theologians described one form of ignorance as blameless because it was, they said, invincible, which is a nice way of saying unavoidable. Their favourite example was that of Aristotle and other pagan philosophers. Wasn't their fault they hadn't been converted to Christianity, since they just happened to live several centuries before the birth of Christ. About culpable ignorance, there is unfortunately so much more to say. This kind of ignorance often involves not wanting to know, or to speak more forcibly, wanting not to know, leading to so many denials, from global warming to the Holocaust. But denials also associated with not wanting other people to know, which is another crucial part of the history of ignorance. Covering up things, keeping secrets. Today, some sociologists describe that last activity as the construction of ignorance. For example, to refer to the long campaign of the tobacco companies to hide the fact that smoking and lung cancer are connected. Maybe you'll say I'm too literal-minded, but I find it rather odd to speak of the construction of something that isn't there. So I would rather go back to an older form of language and talk about maintaining ignorance or keeping people in ignorance. Following the example of a group of 18th century English feminists who collectively accused men of excluding women from education in order to keep them ignorant and so ensure that they were submissive to patriarchy. I could go on for the whole lecture making these distinctions, but I think this is the moment to move to three big questions which will occupy me for the rest of the time. In the first place, a how question. How can anybody write a history of ignorance? Because it's the history of an absence. Secondly, what are the dangers of ignorance? With a little bit added that in certain precise circumstances, ignorance may be a good thing. And finally, the question I've often been asked since the book was published, are we living today in an age of knowledge or an age of ignorance? So I begin with the problem of method. It's obvious that writing the history of any absence is going to pose certain problems. Throughout the research and writing of the book, I was followed by a ghost. I imagined a traditional historian, a hyper-empiricist historian, in my case taking the form of the late Sir Geoffrey Elton, looking over my shoulder and saying, "What's your sources? Where are the documents? How can there be sources for the history of something that isn't there?" Happily, there are some answers to this undeniably awkward question. If direct sources are lacking, there are still indirect sources that we can fall back on. That is, we can study conspicuous absences, significant absences, as Sherlock Holmes did, above all in the famous story about the dog that didn't bark. You'll remember that Holmes recognized the significance of the dog's not barking when the thief came to the stable to steal the racehorse. It signified that the dog knew the thief. So Holmes was dealing with an inside job, and that helped him solve the mystery. Now, in the case of historians of ignorance, what indirect approaches are available? I'll distinguish three. In the first place, every new discovery reveals what people didn't know before. After Columbus made his landfall in 1492, then he revealed a new world, an extra continent which had been unknown to medieval Europeans. And just like the history of exploration, it might be interesting to write the history of science backwards. What was not known before Einstein, or before Darwin, or before Galileo, and so on. Second approach, comparisons in space rather than time, comparisons between regions. For example, I discovered some theorists of education have taken an interest in what they call the null curriculum. That is, what is not being taught in a given school at a given moment. Now, knowing that philosophy has a very important role in the final year or two in the French lycée, in the German gymnasium, and in the Italian liceo, just to mention three, one suddenly becomes aware of the lack of philosophy teaching in sixth forms in many English schools. Third approach to the absence of knowledge, and I think it's the most important of the three, is to focus on the consequences of ignorance, distinguishing between consequences that are positive or benign and those that are absolutely catastrophic. Positive examples were emphasized recently in a series of radio broadcasts entitled The Long History of Ignorance, for which the BBC, or more exactly Rory Stewart, interviewed a number of people, among whom he interviewed me. A famous illustration of the positive view comes from the essays of Michel de Montaigne. He remarked, illiterate peasants, like the ones he knew on his estate and the estates of his neighbours, that he was convinced that they lived a happier life than gentlemen, farmers like himself. Today, an obvious example of benign ignorance is the rule that examiners should not know the identity of the authors of the scripts that they are grading. And the other obvious example is trial by jury, where the jurors have to be isolated from all news about the trial in the newspapers, on television, in social media, so that they will make up their minds on the evidence and only the evidence that's presented to them in court. More difficult is the case about the revelation of secrets by whistleblowers and hackers such as Julian Assange. On one side, difficult not to feel some sympathy, since I expect most of us think there should be more transparency in government. But on the other hand, in certain cases, especially diplomacy, delicate negotiations would be absolutely impossible if the public knew in advance of what was going on. They have to wait until agreement between the parties has been reached. So there are important examples of positive ignorance, but in my opinion, they are completely outweighed by its many disadvantages, that's too mild a word, and its dangers. So I emphasized the malign consequences and showed, for example, that the histories of business, politics, war, and epidemics make this abundantly clear. So in what follows, I now discuss those four domains briefly in order. In the case of business, think of the ignorance of consumers. Sometimes they don't know about the defects of the product they are rushing to buy, or they don't know about the existence of alternatives to that product that might be more reliable. Or think of the ignorance of investors, many of whom do not follow the stock market, do not take an interest in what the company they've invested in is doing, whether it's in oil or whether it's in armaments or whatever, and not knowing anything about the financial situation of that company. Is it borrowing money and so on? And investors have often been deceived by the reports of the possibility of getting rich quick, or by the examples of other people rushing to invest in something and thinking that if they are all doing it, it must be good, which leads to investment bubbles, and bubbles, I don't have to say, tend to burst after a time, as the South Sea bubble burst in the year 1720, and both large and small investors lost a lot of money, although some people knew what was happening in advance and walked away with a big profit. Again, the history of bankruptcies offers, or might offer, vivid examples about what the heads of businesses fail to know. Most obviously, about the existence or the size of a future market for their products or services. But ignorance of this kind is not confined to individuals. So I was very happy to discover that some theorists of business had coined the concept organizational ignorance, because I think this is a powerful force in history and not only in economics. As organizations become large, and especially if they're hierarchical, which they usually are, the power and danger of this kind of ignorance is much increased. It's obvious enough that in any big firm, the CEOs will know things that their employees don't. They're able to see the big picture. They know about the rival companies and their strategies, and possibly by economic spying, they even know what their trade secrets are. But the employees don't know anything of this. But they don't, the CEOs usually, there are exceptions in Japan, usually don't see any need in sharing this kind of knowledge with the people in the workforce. But now, it's also the case, maybe a bit less obviously, that the workers in a given organization know things that the boss doesn't know. They know and understand what they experience every day, maybe on the shop floor, maybe in the office. But they see no reason either to share this with people higher in the hierarchy. So the system is a serious obstacle to the movement of information, highly relevant information, either up or down in the company. You might think that this kind of communication would be facilitated by middle management, but it usually isn't. After all, managers, like other people, are reluctant to speak truth to power, to tell their bosses what the bosses need to know, but happen not to want to know. That would be like telling Stalin that the 5-year plan wasn't working. And the example of Stalin brings us to politics, where I want to say the ignorance of the public can be either an asset or a liability. An asset for dictators, a liability for democracies. It's an asset for dictators, since the more people know about what the regime under which they're living is actually doing, its mistakes, the scale of corruption and so on, the more likely they are to oppose it or even seek to overthrow it. On the other hand, ignorance is a liability for democracies, since ignorant voters may make unwise choices. They may indeed vote against their own interests. as I think happened in the United States a few days ago. And it's for this reason that decades ago, surveys of voter ignorance began to be carried out in Britain, the United States, and other countries. And these surveys are a bit frightening to me because they reveal the sheer numbers of voters, sometimes calculated at about 30%, who are unaware of current political debates in their country, and even of the policies favoured by candidates they intend to vote for. And then, of course, there's international affairs, about which ordinary voters seem to know even less, especially if they live in the centre of a large country such as the United States, rather than on the edge where you're more aware that other countries exist. Now, the ignorance of the public isn't just a case of simple ignorance. They too engage in not wanting to know. It's like putting their head in the sand. Think of the German civilians who tried to ignore the death camps, even the ones situated near their villages. Although these civilians could see, hear, and sometimes even smell what was going on, a point made dramatically in Martin Amis's novel A Zone of Interest, as it was again in the recent film on that subject. And still more serious in their consequences for everybody are the ignorances of political decision makers. For example, many rulers over many centuries have been ignorant of the mood of the people. They would love to know what ordinary people think about them. The problem is that they're protected from that knowledge by their officials, who once again prefer to tell them what they think these kings would like to hear. The awareness of the problem goes back a very long way. There's a recurrent folktale over the centuries about a ruler who disguises himself and walks the street of the capital city at night so he can listen to what people are saying about him. The story is told about Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. It's told about Henry VIII in England. It's told about Ivan the Terrible in Moscow, and so on. And a different kind of ignorance is exemplified today when so much specialized knowledge is necessary to make good decisions. But some presidents don't take this seriously. I was writing this book at the time that both Trump and Bolsonaro were in power, and it certainly made me think I'd found the right subject. Both of them, when they were presidents, denied both global warming and the efficacy of vaccines against COVID. Both men still appeared to be ignorant of their own ignorance. And in foreign affairs, again, people who should know better, a notorious collective example of ignorance at the top was on display in 1919 at the peace settlement in Versailles. President Woodrow Wilson, although he was a scholar, and Prime Minister David Lloyd George were among the few people with the power to redraw the map of Europe. But unfortunately, neither of them knew very much about Europe's complex geography, especially the geography of borderlands and ethnic minorities, the border between Italy and Austria, the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia, and so on. And as in the case of business, a major problem for governments is once again organizational ignorance. 60 years ago, this point was made very clearly by a French sociologist who did his fieldwork interviewing employees in a large organization, the name of which he kept secret, where the people he was talking to said that their bosses were, I quote, too far above the actual work programs to understand what's actually going on. The employees were aware of the problem in their own organization. And what Michel Crozier did was generalize from that, suggesting that the centralization of power in any organization is bound to produce what he calls a blind spot. He summed up the situation in a memorable epigram: those who have the necessary information don't have the power to decide, and those who decide cannot get the necessary information. In my opinion, other kinds of institution, ranging from the army to the church and not neglecting the university, also suffer from organizational ignorance. But as far as I know, no historian, or indeed no sociologist, has yet studied that kind of institution in that kind of way. Let me turn now to the history of war. At this point, I must confess, I've never been a specialist on military history, or at least not since I was a schoolboy who liked to play with soldiers and replay the Battle of Waterloo. But I simply realized in the course of research that wars offer particularly clear examples of the consequences of ignorance. It's punished more rapidly and more visibly, especially in the field of pitched battles, than any other kind of wrong decision-making, except maybe the effect of some unwise economic judgments. In what's been called the fog of battle, commanders are generally ignorant of what the enemy are doing, what's happening on what the Duke of Wellington called the other side of the hill. They don't know the size of the opposing army. They don't know its exact position. They don't know its resources in either food or ammunition. The generals who won battles were simply the generals who were a bit less ignorant than their opposite numbers. So I think the concept of relative ignorance is a useful one here. And I imagine would be also useful in any kind of analysis of conflict or competition. Also important in war, as elsewhere, it is to be conscious of one's own ignorance. Ignorance and arrogance are an absolutely fatal combination that leads to the underestimation of the enemy and then disaster. And professional soldiers are particularly liable to make this mistake when the enemy happen to be amateurs, or as we normally call them, guerrillas. It's a sense of superiority on the part of professionals. You find it, I suppose, in every profession, but it's not always so dangerous as in the military case. And this sense of superiority contributed to the defeat of the French in Indochina in the 1950s, as it did to the defeat of the Americans in Vietnam in the 60s. Of course, I'm not saying those defeats were the simple result of an absence of knowledge, information. One might also say that those French and American generals were in denial. They didn't want to know that the enemy were well trained. didn't want to know that their morale was high, didn't want to know that the defenders obviously knew the terrain much better than the invaders. A situation that's repeating itself at the far end of Europe today. I'd like to focus on a dramatic series of military disasters in the same place. They come from the history of Afghanistan. I chose these examples because they reveal the risks run by leaders who ignore the possible lessons of the past. As you know, historians are often challenged to answer the question, what's the use of history? My usual response to this challenge is to turn the question round, and I point to the more obvious dangers of not knowing about history, not knowing about the past. As Bismarck liked to say, I think this is accurate, but it's a good epigram whether he said it or not. Fools say they learn from experience. I prefer to learn from other people's experience. Now, 3 invasions of Afghanistan went wrong for the invaders. Most recently, the American invasion of 2001, which most of you will remember. Before that, the Russian invasion of 1979, which some people here will remember, and the British invasion of 1839. In the case of that first invasion, organized by the powerful East India Company, the British Army was wiped out by the Afghans. When mission accomplished, it was returning to India as it had to, given the geography of Afghanistan, through narrow mountain passes. And the commander of the army was apparently unaware of the danger of marching through a pass without commanding the heights. And he was also probably ignorant of the fact that the firearms used by the Afghans, the famous Jezzails, which had very long barrels, they had a longer range than the firearms issued to the sepoys in the service of the East India Company. So you can guess what happened. The Afghans occupied the heights and they fired down on an enemy without danger to themselves. You might think that disaster would have served as a warning to later invaders, but it didn't. Just after the Russians invaded in 1979, the British Foreign Office presented a visiting Russian minister with the printed history of the British invasion 140 years earlier. The minister's rather rough response was simply, I won't attempt to imitate the accent, but this time it will be different. But it wasn't. Well, the same goes for the American invasion. 12 years ago, though, the distinguished Scottish historian William Dalrymple published a history of that British-Afghan war, drawing parallels between the British invasion and the recent American one. Soon after his book was published, he was invited to brief National Security, CIA, and Defense in Washington to bring them up to par on the history of Afghanistan. The Americans had finally become aware of the cost of their ignorance. Turning now to the 4th domain, the history of epidemics. I think it is illuminating, maybe even encouraging, to view COVID as the latest in a very long series, including in chronological order, bubonic plague in Asia and Europe between the 14th and the 17th centuries, smallpox in Europe and the Americas between the 16th and the 18th centuries, cholera in the 19th century, and the so-called Spanish flu in the earlier 20th century. There are other examples, but these are the big killers. In each case, when the epidemic struck, no one knew where it came from, how it spread, by what means to resist it. And as a result, countless lives were lost before the necessary knowledge was acquired by experience. Because on occasion, measures that had been adopted to counter the disease actually made it worse. A famous Italian historian, Carlo Cipolla, wrote a book about the plague of 1630, which hit northern Italy particularly hard. And he pointed out that the religious services, which multiplied, praying to God to take the plague away, made them much worse thanks to contagion. Now, a recurrent consequence of ignorance in the case of epidemics is collective panic. And that leads to the need to find human scapegoats for catastrophe, and so an increased susceptibility to conspiracy theories. And I'm happy to say that fake news is now being taken seriously by historians and social scientists. But I do wonder whether they ought to be devoting the larger part of their attention to the people that are sending the fake messages, because I would think equally important is to study the susceptibility of the people who see or hear the messages and what circumstances they're in. The same person who might be skeptical in peacetime or when everybody around is healthy may become a believer in conspiracy theory in different circumstances. During the bubonic plague of 1348 to 9, rumors spread that the Jews were responsible. And from Germany to Spain, crowds attacked synagogues. The Jews were supposed to have poisoned the wells. Again, during the outbreak of the Great Plague in Milan in the year 1630, it was widely believed that the deaths were the result of a conspiracy by a group that were called the Untori, that is, the anointers, that they were a group that was supposed to have been seen spreading poisonous ointment on the walls of the city so that everybody would die of plague. Now, unfortunately, detecting and replacing ignorance or false knowledge is a process that has to be repeated in the case of each new epidemic. And during COVID, as you know, conspiracy theories resurfaced yet again. Some Americans claimed that COVID was spread by the Chinese. For their part, the Chinese claimed it had all been planned by the American army. Rumors of this kind are often a response to a lack of information, and the public has often been kept ignorant of information that would embarrass either companies or governments. As you know, some of these cover-ups have been revealed by whistleblowers who pointed to the danger of smoking, the toxic effects of industrial pollution, or of pharmaceuticals launched on the market while keeping the public ignorant of potential unfortunate side effects. But political cover-ups too are legion. Think, especially many of you will remember, if you were adults in 1986, of the explosion at the nuclear plant at Chernobyl. And it's extremely ironic that that accident happened so soon after Gorbachev had launched his policy of transparency in government, glasnost. And yet the Soviet government did not immediately reveal to the world what had happened. The first news about the explosion came from Sweden, where climate scientists noticed that local radiation had increased at an absolutely alarming rate. To be fair, the Soviet government soon cooperated, but not in those first days. Time, finally, to answer my third question about changes over the long term. Some periods in the past have been described as ages of ignorance or darkness, and contrasted with later ages of enlightenment and knowledge, usually placed, of course, in the present. In the 18th century, the Middle Ages were described as dark. In Islam, Muslims still speak of the period before Muhammad as the age of ignorance. And what about our own time? I've often been asked whether or not we know more or less than our ancestors. As maybe you will guess, my answer to this question is always both yes and no, because I want to distinguish between collective knowledge and individual ignorance. On one side, thanks to the accumulation of research, humanity as a whole has never known more than it knows now. But as individuals, we know about the same amount as our ancestors. The waking hours in which we might learn more are maybe a bit more abundant than theirs, but not enough to make a real difference. So what you decide to know means deciding not to know something else. Today, the younger generation has acquired new kinds of knowledge of the online world that an older generation, myself very much included, totally lacks. But what's the price? The price of that new knowledge is ignorance of much that the older generations took for granted. Knowledge of the Bible, knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, knowledge of literary classics such as Tolstoy or Shakespeare. The list could go on easily. But there's another problem today, which I want to formulate in the form of a paradox. The rapid increase of information sometimes facilitates ignorance. It happens as a result of what has become known to historians and others as information overload. Speaking in more concrete terms, today there's not enough time to select and test the raw information that's coming in, and by processing it in this way, turning it into knowledge and communicating it to others. Before the process is finished, in the case of one wave, another wave of new information has already arrived. So the people doing the verification and the classification and the other things that you need to do to the data, they're constantly running to catch up. And that has sometimes very serious consequences. Take the memorable and tragic case of 9/11, since it seems fairly clear that the American Secret Services, and it's a problem that there are several of them rather than one, that they were aware in advance of the possibility, maybe the probability, of an imminent attack by terrorists on American soil. And the government apparently did receive warnings, but these warnings were overlooked, lost among the immense number of other messages which different parts of government were trying to deal with at the very same moment. Afterwards, when Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was asked to explain the apparent failure of intelligence on that occasion, she simply remarked, "There was a lot of chatter in the system." That is, information overload. A fatal example of the organizational ignorance that I was talking about just a few minutes ago. In short, I think there's a good case for describing our own century as an age of ignorance as well as an age of knowledge. If there's a lesson to be drawn, it's a lesson in humility. As an American humorist once remarked, I think it was Mark Twain, anyway, he said, "We are all ignorant, just of different things." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that engaging, stimulating and incredibly informative lecture. I'm not going to detain the audience long. I'm sure you all want to get to the drinks reception, but it's my role to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of the university and of the history department to Peter for his lecture. As Laura already said, Professor Peter Burke was one of the founding generation of historians at Sussex. I think it's right to say that his work has continued to shape the agenda of the history department at Sussex after his departure from the university. It's certainly true that cultural history, social history, and forms of intellectual history would look very different as they are practiced in the UK today if it wasn't for the influence and inspiration, I think, of Peter's work. Listening to the lecture, one can hardly miss many of the qualities that I think have characterized Peter's work over many years and many decades. And these are the things I think that I really associate with his work. Deeply learned, one might say monstrously erudite was the phrase used at the beginning of the lecture. Constantly entertaining, full of those surprising connections between time and space. And I think most importantly, using history to reveal something new about our own predicament, as happened at the end of the lecture there, and about how we ourselves think, or how we don't think, or maybe how we don't know, as the case may be. And I'm just going to give you a quick personal reminiscence. I myself first encountered some of those qualities back in the mid-1990s when I was lucky enough to be taught by Peter as an undergraduate. The paper he supervised then was called the Historical Anthropology of Early Modern Europe. And I have a feeling it was on that paper that I first encountered people like Marshall Salins, Clifford Geertz, as well as Carlo Ginzburg, all three great names in history and anthropology. It was a thrilling intellectual experience for me, but what really sticks in my mind about that term was the real interest that Peter took, not only in what I was writing as a student, but in what I was reading. I was amazed, and I was probably a bit smug, when I mentioned a book I was reading that Peter had apparently not read, but even did not appear to be aware of. And I was even more amazed, and this is the image that sticks in my mind, when he went to the trouble of writing down the bibliographic details of that book on an individual index card, which then got filed away in what my brain remembers as a gigantic set of index card boxes in his office, which looked like a kind of private library catalogue. I'm not sure if you still have this, but I remember that vividly. The point of this story is not just that the kind of scholarship that Peter makes look so effortless, as I think he just did in the lecture, really does require an extraordinary bibliographic database that in those days had to be done in hard copy. The other point of the story is that he bothered in the first place to pay attention to what an undergraduate was reading, a mark, I think, of his extreme intellectual curiosity, and also, I think, his intellectual generosity. I won't go on for much longer, as I'm sure, as I said, people want to enjoy the drinks, but I do want to say a few things. Read the book. It is not only incredibly informative, but it is also very entertaining and brilliantly written. So do take the time to read it. As Peter said at the end, many have feared that we are indeed living through an age of ignorance. But nobody else, I think, has really shown how we need to historicise that description, or how the relationship between our knowledge and our ignorance is in fact more complicated than the age of ignorance tag might have us believe. Finally, just a few words of thanks to different groups of people. Thanks very much to Faye, to Tom, and everybody else in the events team for organising this lecture so brilliantly. We're very grateful. You've made our lives in the department much easier. Thanks also to Laura Ginn. I've lost Lara Ginn. Without whose inspiration, I think, we would probably never have got to the point of organising this lecture. So thanks very much, Lara. So that just leaves me to thank very much, again, Professor Peter Burke for giving us a very enjoyable and stimulating lecture, and to invite everybody else to join us now for drinks over there at the drinks reception. Thank you very much.